Transformation Audit. As some of you probably know, that the Transformation Audit is our annual edited publication with contributions from some of the country's leading scholars and opinion leaders. Our aim with this publication is to provide deeper insight on how we as a nation can build a more inclusive economy, which is critical for strengthening national reconciliation in our democracy. And of course, this is a vision that has been captured also by the National Planning Commission through the National Development Plan. And so for the 2012 edition, we have exclusively focused on youth and youth in the economy. As you all know, that it's quite a topical issue at the moment. And so without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Jan Hofmeyer, who is the head of the policy and analysis team at the RGR. He's also the editor of the Transformation Audit, and he's going to do a brief presentation of this year's publication. And then afterwards, Dr. Zuki Sikobo and Ms. Tamele Mete will also be giving us a brief overview of their own articles that they've contributed to this publication. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayanda. Thank you, Evelyn, also for your welcome. Mzukize and Sitimbele, thank you also for making it this morning. And also to all of you for joining us this morning. I've also seen Justin Sylvester there at the back from the Open Society Foundation, who has also sort of sponsored this publication for us, which we think is a very important publication and also contribution to our national policy discourse. So we're also very thankful for that support, Justin. This year's Transformation Audit focuses specifically on the question of youth, and we've really been inspired by the National Development Plan. I think for a number of reasons. Firstly, because it's the first long-term strategy for South Africa to move forward. It's a strategy against which we can measure policy and see whether we're charting the way that we should be doing. Secondly, by its very nature, this is a youth-biased document. It's a document that looks forward and asks how will the future of our young South Africans be. But there's a specific quote in the final draft of the report that really caught our attention, and it referred specifically to South Africa's very young population, the youth demography. And it made a comment about that demographic makeup, and it said, if not managed, this perfect window can become the perfect storm. Now, the perfect window that they're talking about is what we call a demographic dividend, or the demographic sweet spot. In other words, a population where there is a low ratio between the working age population between 15 and 65, and the dependents younger than that age and older than that age. In South Africa, the census of 2011 showed us that about 66% of South Africans are younger than the age of 35. We've also seen over the years that growth rates, population growth rates, have also decreased. So what we're seeing, we're not there yet, but we're moving into that space where we as a country might hit that specific demographic sweet spot. But, and this is where the potential for the perfect storm that the NDP document raises, and that is that 71% of our working age population is unemployed. And 71% of the working age unemployed is younger than 35. 41% of young people are not in education, not in employment, and not in any form of training. And as the latest youth gauge, the youth poverty gauge that was released last year shows, about 43% of children find themselves in the poorest 20% of our population, in the poorest quintile of our population. So Ayanda has given us a brief background about the audit. I do not want to add much more, but saying that this is our contribution, IJR's contribution specifically, looking at how do we as an institute contribute to the pursuit of an inclusive society, and our inclusive economies project in particular is really sort of focused on trying to distill, you know, the key lessons that we can learn from creating an inclusive society. The publication itself is composed of 4 chapters. We look at the macroeconomy or economic governance. We look at the labor market. We look at skills and education and its links to the labor market, and ultimately also how that impacts on poverty and inequality. Now, every year we choose a specific theme that we use as a prism to look at those four focus areas. And this year we've also approached young South Africans, young emerging scholars and thinkers, also to write on these specific issues. And therefore we're also very happy to have Mzukisi and Stimbili here, who contributed to this year's publication. You will see most of the articles revolve around questions of the labor market, how the issue of skills and education related, and also what does the National Development Plan say about the integration of young people in the economy itself. Each of the chapters consists either of a scorecard of different indicators, critical indicators about the specific focus areas, and then there are also review chapters and also specific opinion chapters. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is just to go through a few of those chapters and also just highlight some of the issues in the scorecards itself. This scorecard is the one for our economic governance chapter, and it just shows South Africa's growth, GDP growth last year in comparison to several of our emerging peers. Now, all of our emerging peers have experienced declines in their GDP growth last year, as did we. 2.5%, as we all know, is not sufficient to reach the developmental goals that we have set ourselves as a society, and specifically also not those that have been highlighted also in the National Development Plan. What 2.5% growth means for us is less revenues than we had in the past, which also means that we can no longer sustain a model of high unemployment, high levels of dependency on a social welfare system, and then in addition also a very high public sector wage as a public sector wage as a percentage of government expenditure. We also have to think forward and spend on infrastructure, and such growth levels at present is not sort of sustainable. We've seen that we also have to borrow more, and although our debt as a percentage of our GDP is still comparatively low to many of our other peers, it is a figure that has been rising, as was the case with our budget deficit last year. So just moving over to some of the key insights with regard to the economic governance chapter, and Simbile will talk in more sort of depth about her specific chapter focusing on the NDP. But safe to say this at this specific moment, the NDP comes at a very opportune time. I think what we've seen in our body politic over the last year, it has been sort of a fragmentation in society, and we've seen that not only between the key constituencies such as labour, government, and business, but we've also seen it within those constituencies. The violence that we've seen yesterday, for example, at the Siphumelele shaft of Amplats, has been conflict that is existing and has been brewing for some time between rival unions. We've been seeing this in business. Last year we've seen the split between BUSA and the BCC. We also see several sort of arms of government not always working together towards common goals. So therefore, I think the NDP really comes at an opportune time, again, also to focus our attention on one goal forward. Very importantly also, it prioritizes a society that offers opportunity for young South Africans. But I think it's also important to say that now that we've adopted this plan, it's not really plain sailing. I think, you know, if one has looked at the comments with regard to the NDP across all sectors, there has been very sort of broad endorsement, but I think one must also sort of remember that this is a 430-page document that contains very detailed suggestions, and I think what we will see from now on is a contestation for which of those ideas should be prioritized. In other words, there are many sort of political battles still to be fought. And then there are also contextual circumstances that will play into the implementation of the NDP. The NDP itself sets itself specific goals based also on the assumption of certain levels of growth. Now what we've seen just in the scorecard in the previous slide is that 2.5% is not a sustainable figure for growth. And if we look forward, this is likely to be a sort of the trajectory, at least for a number of years. And therefore, we will have to decide how we go forward. We have to make sure that we extract what we can from such low levels of growth, but it will also mean that we will have to prioritize certain things. And the NDP itself makes it very clear that one of the areas that it will prioritize from the beginning is that the labour market become much more accessible to young South Africans. But sort of given this young demography that we have, we must also factor in that the material consequences of economic policy will ultimately also have an impact on the political behavior of our electorate. Just last year, the first group of young South Africans born in a free South Africa turned voting age, 1994 to 2012, 18 years. That was the first group of young South Africans born in a free South Africa, and their political knowledge, things that inspire them, influence their opinion, is very different from a generation that has lived through a specific transition. And Zulu will make a few comments also about what implication this may have also for party politics. This is just the labour market scorecard, just a quick overview. The unemployment level that we used last year when we drew up the scorecards at that stage, still a quarter of the population or working age population unemployed. The unemployment level for young people under the age of 35 of the working age population is about 71%. And if we go down, we see that the employment absorption rate, in other words, the percentage of working age population actually being in a job is just 41.3%. And if you look at the labour force participation rate, in other words, that percentage of the working age South Africans either working or looking for a job is 55%. So about 45% of South Africans of working age are not working. Many of them, and you will see the figures in the labour chapter, have become discouraged workers, and that growth in the number of discouraged workers has been very visible, specifically since the recession. So what the chapter itself shows us that like in any other country, young people are more vulnerable in the labour market because they enter with less qualifications, less experience. Usually they get shorter-term contracts, and when an economy goes south, they are also usually the first to be retrenched. But in South Africa, we have a much more sort of acute situation where the levels of education of young people make it difficult for them to enter the labour market in the first place. We see that there is also a very strong skills bias developing in our economy. Since 2008, the only people who have seen sort of a growth in their opportunities for employment were those who had either sort of a matric, a secondary qualification, or a tertiary education. In all other sectors, especially also in the informal sector, there has been net job losses. So qualifications become increasingly important for young people. Again, that figure of 71%. And in the chapter that was written by Neil Rankman and his colleagues from WITS, he shows specifically how negatively 15 to 24-year-olds have been impacted upon since the recession in 2009. We've seen just in that short period, 2008 to 2010, a 6% increase in unemployment for young females in that age group. We've seen a 4% increase for young males. And if you compare that with people between the ages of 35 to 65, that figure has been much lower at only 2%. And the unemployment level is one area of concern, but I think what should be of more concern is also the labour market sort of participation rate. In other words, those people actually working or looking for a job somewhere. In other words, people still feel bold enough to go out there and find a job. And for that specific age category, working age people younger than 25, in other words, that's 15 to 24, only 1 in 8 people are sort of participating in that process. And this is much lower than in our peer sort of emerging countries, specifically countries like the BRICS, where that number is about 40%. So there are a number of policies that one can address this with, in the last year we've seen our national policy discourse moving increasingly in that direction. The number of options that Rankin and his colleagues suggest is firstly looking at stimulating the demand side of the economy, in other words, giving people tax breaks, or increasing grants and pensions, but this is not a sustainable way of looking at things. The funds is in any case not there. The second option is the much talked about youth wage subsidy. I've seen sort of in the media that many people sort of drew the conclusion from the president's speech that this is what is going to be endorsed soon. I don't think the president mentioned anything about the youth wage subsidy in his speech itself, but apart from mentioning that towards the end of the month, NETLAC, an agreement will be signed at NETLAC around specific principles relating to youth access. It might very well take the form of a youth wage subsidy, but another measure that's also been introduced or suggested is a job seekers grant. The conclusion that this chapter comes to is that there is no one specific silver bullet with which we're going to address the question of youth unemployment. It has to be something that is a comprehensive approach which includes labour market policy. But firstly, we also have to get our education system right and focus on qualifications, which brings us to the next chapter, which is skills and education. This is just comes from some of the scorecards in the skills and education chapter, and these are statistics that come from the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, which was released last year. And these are just sort of a ranking that that I've put together to show how we compare to some of our emerging peers in BRICS, but I've also included a country like Indonesia, with which we're also compared to, and also Nigeria, which is a new sort of emerging economy, which many people argue might surpass South Africa in size within due course. And there you see the state of our education system in global comparison. We rank 140 out of 144. Quality of maths and science education, 143 out of 144. The availability of scientists and engineers in global comparison, also 143. There are also areas where we do very well. Some things like the quality of research institutions in global comparison. There is also the regulation of our financial system, which I also mentioned in the introduction to this publication, where we rank first. So there are areas where we're actually doing well, but these very critical sort of education-related measurements, they're also critical building blocks for those areas, such as financial regulation. We won't be able to sustain those things if we're not able to get these basic things right. So just to reiterate then what also, also the conclusion in the labour market chapter is that there is a positive correlation between the levels of education and the likelihood to obtain employment. The statistics are also there in your publication, where it is very clear that this is the case. There are continued concerns with regard to the quality of our educational outputs, but I think a bigger concern is the high dropout rates that we see. The survival rate, which many educationists refer to as the number of young people that manage to get through the system from grade 1 to grade 12, is less than 50%. Some organizations or research by institutions like Equal Education suggest that it's even less than 40%, more in the area of about 38%. So it's imperative to keep young people in education, and the target that the NDP sets is that 80 to 90% of young people must remain into the schooling system until the 12th grade. But there are also some who argue, and also Professor Peliwe Nolwana in her chapter in the audit, that argues that we should not only focus on universal enrollment, but we also should focus on universal school completion. In addition, there's also this need to enable people who have not managed to pass their matric or the senior certificate the first time around, to keep them in the system and allow them to succeed, because this has become the absolute minimum qualification that signals something to the labour market. So it's critical that South Africans, even if they are older, even if they have not managed to pass the first time around, that they go through the system and succeed. And I think therefore the fact that our president also in the State of the Nation speech has singled out Mr. Sipho Mabuza for at a very late age passing matric, I think that sets an example that should be emulated. Going to the final chapter, just also various brief overview of our sort of developmental questions or issues that we have to deal with. Our population, as we learned last year from the census, 51.7 million. What we know from the national income dynamics studies that were completed in 2008, at that stage, 41% of South Africans still live under the poverty line. This has been a significant decrease over the years, but it is still substantial. Our Gini coefficient is a figure that is highly contested amongst economists in South Africa. People arguing about how it is being composed, but some researchers like Marie Brandt and Ingrid Woolard at UCT give us the figure of 0.7, which makes us by far the most unequal emerging country. And I also recently saw that the 0.7 is also the figure that the World Bank uses. What we've seen from the census is that the average household income is now about 103,000, but this is income that is very highly or very unequally distributed. We still saw that black income as a percentage of white income is still 16%, which still points to that very large sort of inequality. We've seen that household sizes have decreased to about 3.4 people per household, but we've also seen that households have increased. The number of households have increased. We also have very broad-ranging implications for developmental policy, and we continue to see sort of a growth in the number of South Africans that receive social grants and pension support from government. The last figure that I worked with, which appeared last year, was about 15.6 million. The graph just below the table shows us just the increase in the number of grant recipients since 2000, and also the percentage that it constitutes as a percentage of GDP. And just sort of referring back to my first slide, that if you look at the trajectory of this growth, which largely sort of occurred under circumstances of robust economic growth that really peaked around 2006, it is very sort of obvious here that this trajectory cannot be sustained in the longer term. So again, this very high level of inequality, 0.7% Gini coefficient, and what we see is that this inequality has largely been entrenched by historical discrimination, but what we've seen specifically since the political transition is that inequality has been driven also by the widening gap, income gap between people. And this in turn one can largely then also attribute to skills and the question, or the high demand that there exists for skills, the high premium that people are willing to pay for skills in the economy, which drives up salaries and wages on one end and pushes down wages on the other. There has been a decline in income poverty, as I just mentioned, but what most developmental economists point to is that this decline has largely been driven by the expansion of the social security scheme, and not as much by employment as we want to. And therefore, also referring then to the article of Catherine Hall that looks at childhood poverty and intergenerational poverty, where she finds that by far the vast majority of children find themselves in poor households. Figure that I mentioned there at the beginning of the presentation again, 43% of children find themselves within the poorest 20% of our population. The comparative figure for adults is 26%, and only 8% of children find themselves in the richest 20%. Comparative figure for adults there is 15%. So what she also suggests in her article is that children who grow up poor are also likely to become poor parents, and therefore we see this reinforcement, re-entrenchment of this pattern or this cycle of poverty and inequality. So this needs to be broken, and therefore one also has to look at how and which will be the key interventions to be made. Poverty can not only be measured in terms of income, and where we've seen significant gains that have been made is in terms of young people's access to certain amenities such as safe water, decent housing and sanitation. And you will also see in the publication the graph that really also indicates the progress that has been made. Yet about 6 million children still do not have access to safe water supply. 5 million do not have adequate sanitation. a very sort of important finding that also comes from the child gauge, which is being reported upon in the audit, is a significant decline in child hunger, and many attribute this also to the impact of the child support grant. So when one sees all of these statistics, one can very easily be thinking that we might be heading for what the National Planning Commission calls the perfect storm. But I think I have to sort of caution everybody also here that what I mentioned is statistics, but statistics also have very very limited use in certain contexts. And there was this brilliant article just yesterday, also in the New York Times, on the limitations of data. And one of the limitations that they pointed out is that it cannot capture sentiment, it cannot capture things like hope and emotion and trust, etc. And when people ask me about what does this all mean for South Africa, I find this this example quite a quick sort of analogy. About 10, 12 years ago, the economists referred to the African continent as the hopeless continent, looking and pointing out to existing facts that were wars, poverty, business not making headway, failed state, etc. But what has happened in the period in between is that many countries have returned to peace. What one has seen is that governments have been able to implement macroeconomic policy. These policies gained traction, and last year, and actually over the past 10 years, Africa has started to grow, and last year and the year before, it was the second fastest growing region globally. So now people are talking no longer about the hopeless continent, but Africa rising. And so when we look at these very intimidating statistics about South Africa, this is not something that should make us hopeless. It's something that should inspire us. So, next slide. The future is open-ended. It's not being determined by what we see now. We're also humans with our own agency, and South Africans committed to a country that works, because after all, this is the only country that we have. So just in conclusion then, just a last few final thoughts just to pull everything together. It is true that the South African politic has become highly fragmented, and it is very problematic, especially under conditions of low growth, social strife, etc. But I do think that the National Development Plan is one of those documents in our society that the center, at least in our politics, can coalesce around. This is not to say that the NDP should become the new mantra and something that every government minister should refer to when he or she is in the corner. It is something that we will have to interrogate, and indeed the devil may still be in the detail. We will have to start implementing, because we're 17 years away from 2030, where we have those targets of lower levels of unemployment, etc. And we will have to prioritize under current conditions of low growth. And we need to leverage those areas which we have control over. And I would suggest that one of them is the education system, and the other is access to, or enabling access to the labour market. And therefore, I think it's also very encouraging that we've seen, especially over the past year or two, that the question of education, of youth access, have become front of mind in the eyes of the South African media, but also within the South African policy community. And these things usually take time. When one looks at the targets now, it looks insurmountable, but when we really sort of target and remain focused on an issue, and I think the example of how we have dealt with the question of HIV/AIDS, which has been a burden for a very long time until we really decided we are going to take action. and we are actually arresting levels, HIV/AIDS growth levels, and the future looks much brighter in that regard than it did 10 years ago. And then just lastly, to borrow from the NDP title, it is our future, and therefore we have to make it work. We can shape it, and even though these indicators might stem us sort of negatively, there is also much to work with in the society we live in.